Hi everyone, nice to see you all again. Today we're going to be looking at a subject that's of interest to a lot of people who study Japanese, me included. This isn't a standalone video, it's actually the first video in a series about pitch accent because it's quite a complex topic and I don't think that I can do it justice in a single video. Just by way of background, when I was studying Japanese at university from 1995 to 1999, back in the day, pitch accent was hardly touched upon at all. It was never systematically explained to us by anybody. Occasionally it would be mentioned in passing by our native Japanese conversation teachers. But to be honest, it wasn't mentioned very often and I really don't remember people being corrected on it, even by these Japanese natives. So I personally, and I think this goes for most people who study Japanese, was never really corrected on it at university. I was actually very rarely corrected on it by Japanese friends when I lived in Japan, though I was occasionally corrected. And in later life, so to speak, when I've done Japanese lessons on italki, it's hardly ever been corrected. Hardly any Japanese person ever brings it up of their own accord for some reason. They do, but not very often. It seems to be generally true that pitch accent is overwhelmingly neglected in Japanese language instruction, and it's quite interesting, I think. Why should that be the case? This is something that we're going to look at in this series of videos. A few years ago, I got a postgraduate education in phonetics and phonology. And thanks to that education and my own independent studies, I now have a much more rigorous understanding of phonetics and phonology in general. When I speak Japanese, my use of pitch accent is decidedly imperfect. I do wish that I had learnt it much more rigorously back at university. I do wish that I'd focused on it more when I was in the early stages of learning Japanese. I think that would have been very helpful, and I think it would have given me much more confidence that I was using the correct intonation patterns, if you like, when I spoke Japanese. That said, I do think that I have a reasonably good ear, and that has allowed me over the years to pick up on the correct intonation patterns by and large for Japanese utterances as a whole. And to a significant extent, I think that allowed me to compensate for the fact that there were quite a lot of localized lexical problems with the way I used pitch accent. What I'm saying is that when I speak Japanese people probably consider me on the whole to be someone who has a generally quite good intonation, but they certainly hear localized inaccuracies. They'll think, oh, you went up down where you should have gone down up. That obviously is not technical terminology, but nonetheless, they'll hear that I've gone up when I should have gone down, or vice versa, and that'll sound a bit strange to them. And to some extent, it will make my Japanese harder for them to understand, though probably not to any particularly great extent. These are things that we're going to be talking about later on in these videos. When I lived in Japan, and I spent about 4 years in total living in Japan, when I lived in Japan, I did notice quite often that there were discrepancies between the way in which natives would pronounce things pitch-wise and the way that I would pronounce things pitch-wise. For what it's worth, I lived in and around the Tokyo region, so that's the type of Japanese predominantly that I was exposed to. It seems very strange to me now, but I never made any systematic attempt to figure out exactly what was going on, exactly why the natives were using one sort of pitch pattern when I was using some other sort of pitch pattern. I think that when you live in a country, and when you work in a country, and when you work often in Japanese language environments, you start to develop a feeling that you must be doing pretty well with the language, otherwise you wouldn't be communicating the way you're communicating. And that can lead to a situation in which you tend to downplay some of the problems that still exist within your own, in this case, Japanese. You know that there are some discrepancies between the way you say things and the way natives say things, but you think, well, it can't be that important, can it? It was only many years later, when I was getting back into studying foreign languages and when I was developing more of an interest in linguistics in general, that I started to think back on these experiences that I'd had in Japan many years before and ask myself, what was going on there? What was the problem? Why didn't you care about it? Why wasn't your ear good enough to allow you to naturally pick up on these pitch patterns that were being used by the natives? Eventually, I was forced to the conclusion that my Japanese pronunciation had never actually been as good as I had believed that it was. In terms of the individual sounds that I make when I speak Japanese, I think my pronunciation is generally pretty good. But pitch-wise, there was a serious lack of understanding of certain phenomena that exist within Japanese, and that lack of understanding inevitably resulted in inaccuracies in the way I spoke. Back then, if somebody had told me that my grasp of Japanese pitch accent, of intonation if you want to call it that, was weak, I would probably have got quite defensive and annoyed about it. I'd have said, well, people seem to understand me, you know, so what, this stuff can't be that important. But today I feel quite differently about it. Today my ego is much less invested than it was back then in my Japanese abilities, and I think that I'm in a position to evaluate myself in this regard a bit more calmly, a bit more rationally. It's annoying to have to admit it. I don't like having to admit this, but I do realize when I speak Japanese, when I think about my own knowledge of Japanese, that I just don't know how certain common words are supposed to be pronounced. For example, if you think of the traditional Japanese samurai sword, well, it's a katana as you would pronounce it in English, right? But how do the Japanese say it? It's only 3 syllables, 3 mora, if you want to call them mora, katana. But how are you supposed to say it? Do you say katana, or do you say katana, or do you say katana? Now, if you're anything like me, you'll immediately be able to tell that katana sounds weird. But hey, maybe it's right. Maybe I just never noticed that was the correct pronunciation. And even if it is wrong, which of the other 2 then is correct? Why don't I know this? What does it say about me as a student of Japanese that I don't know this? Shouldn't I know this? One of the problems with pitch accent and any attempt to analyze pitch accent is that it seems to be quite a slippery subject, conceptually speaking. This is something that we're going to be looking at in detail in these videos. Some people will tell you that it's very important, but how can we explain the fact that it's almost completely neglected by serious, conscientious, native Japanese teachers? You can't imagine any serious teacher of Chinese ignoring tones, and you can't imagine any serious teacher of English ignoring stress. Yet it remains a fact. Serious teachers of Japanese, native Japanese teachers of Japanese who have an essentially perfect understanding of the correct pitch patterns to use, don't teach it. They don't teach it, and they overwhelmingly will not correct their students when they make mistakes with it. Why? There's a lot of stuff to address here, and we will be addressing it in this series of videos. I just want to say a couple of words about what we're not going to be doing in these videos. I'm not going to be trying to provide any rigorous explanation of how pitch accent works. I have a reasonably decent understanding of it now, but if you want to study it, then I strongly recommend that you use Dogen's course. It is presumably still available on Patreon. I don't know exactly where he keeps it. I don't know to what extent he's expanded it now, because I myself haven't looked at it for a few years, but I strongly recommend it. And no, he's not paying me to say this. I actually do recommend it. It's very carefully thought out, it's very well presented, it's very educational. What I want to do in this series of videos is engage in a broader and more general discussion about pitch accent. Why is it important? Is it important? How is it important? Should you learn it? Should you not learn it? If you do decide to learn it, how much time should you spend focusing on it, etc., etc. So this video is more of an introduction to this series than anything else. That's all for today. See you next time. Thank you. Ciao, ciao.